Hello and welcome to the Subject Injury mini webinar hosted by PFS Clinical. My name is Jody Ingebritsen-Howe and I will be talking you through the basics of subject injury for the purposes of research studies. Just as some background, PFS Clinical works with clients of all shapes and sizes, from small dedicated research sites to major medical institutions. So my coverage today is intended to capture the basics so it applies to all entities performing research. So before I dive in, I just want to talk a little bit about what we'll cover today. So first we'll start with the ideal definition of subject injury. I will also cover what documents are going to talk about this language, who will pay for costs related to subject injuries, and the difference between subject injury and indemnification. And I'll end the webinar by talking about PFS Clinical's recommendations. So first of all, let's talk about the definition of subject injury. We're talking about an injury, an illness, an adverse event or reaction, basically anything up to and including death caused by a study subject's involvement in the study. So to break that down a little bit, first of all, we want to list as many reactions as possible. And by reactions, I mean injury, illness, adverse event, reaction, that stuff. So if a sponsor is trying to limit the definition of a subject injury to physical injuries only, for example, it would not cover any change in the subject's mental status that they would experience. Let's say it's due to a drug. It would also be harder to argue payment for an allergic reaction if they were to limit it to physical injuries only. You might be able to capture that into a physical injury just because it's a change in the physicality if it's an allergic reaction, but our take here is that it's better for the definition to be more expansive than necessary, than not quite broad enough. So where you're going to find subject injury language is in two places. You'll find it in the informed consent form, first of all, and the subject injury language in the ICF is the way for the sponsor to communicate to subjects exactly what will happen with any medical bills they may incur as a result of the study. So it'll be pretty basic, but it will talk about the actual, what will happen to those bills. The second place you'll find it is in the clinical trial agreement. And the language in the CTA is going to be a little bit more detailed. It'll hash out exactly what bills the institution can expect the sponsor to cover, and exactly what conditions from the sponsor must occur or not occur for the sponsor to cover those costs. So that's a little confusing, but basically they'll put some contingencies on what they will or will not cover, and I'll talk about that a little later. So generally the CTA will go into more detail regarding the compensation, just because that's really the legal document between the two potential payers of these costs. And just as a side note, you really want to be mindful of any edits you make to the ICF and the CTA during negotiation. So upon finalization of both documents, you want to make sure you haven't created any inconsistencies, any discrepancies between the two documents, because that'll only create headaches for you down the road. So who is going to pay for subject injuries? And basically, the short answer is that the sponsor should pay. So it is, after all, the sponsor's study. It's going to be their drug, their device, their overall study design, that in the protocol that they developed. And the study subjects are volunteers. So the sponsor really should pay for everything. The longer answer, the more technical answer, is that, you don't really get a lot of fight from sponsors that they're going to pay for subject injuries, but they're going to put some contingencies on the agreement to pay. So they'll say they'll pay as long as injuries aren't caused by the institution's failure to follow the protocol, failure to follow written instructions, any of their bad acts, and that means their recklessness, their misconduct, stuff like that, their mess ups, their violation of laws, that kind of thing. And this is all reasonable. But just be careful that they're not trying to throw something else in there as well. And I'll talk about that a little later too. But basically, these contingencies, to sort of tie it into the last slide, those are really only going to be found in the CTA. You're not going to see those in the informed consent form. The subject probably doesn't need to know about all of that. They just want to know that their bills will be covered. So this stuff will really only show up in the CTA itself. So this slide will talk about the difference between subject injury language and indemnification language. So frequently we see this language missing from contracts altogether, but we do see language referring to the indemnification. So the sponsor saying they will indemnify institution for physical injuries related to the study drug. And our take here is that that's just not sufficient. We really need to separate subject injury compensation language into either its own provision or into a way so that it's really not tied in any way to legal proceedings at all. So let's dive into that a little further. I have included here a very simple example of indemnification language, and it just in the way that it touches on subject injuries. So it says that sponsor will indemnify, defend, and hold harmless institution indemnities, which will be defined, the employees working on behalf of the institution, from and against any losses or claims arising out of the physical injury or illness caused by the study. That language is saying that the sponsor will indemnify the institution for subject injuries, which says that they will assume and pay for all lawsuits that the study subject may file or that someone may file on behalf of the study subject in relation to those injuries or illnesses. So the reason this isn't sufficient, for the record, we do want to keep this language in. We want indemnification for these lawsuits. Absolutely. The sponsor should defend us against any lawsuit brought by a subject injury. But without having that separated subject injury language, what's happening here is that we're saying the subjects would have to file a lawsuit in order to get those medical bills paid. So if you have the subject injury language separate from indemnification, ideally, the sponsor is saying that they will pay those bills without anyone having to file a lawsuit or file a complaint against them. To make this a little easier to digest and put it in as an example, let's say Grandpa's involved in a study and the study drug causes him to have kidney stones. It's a known side effect of the drug. The sponsor owns up. They say, yeah, this is caused by the study drug. But, Grandpa's in a lot of pain. Maybe he needs laser treatment to break up those kidney stones so that they can pass. If we don't have subject injury language separated from indemnification, and we're going to just ignore, there's nothing in the ICF for the purpose of this example, what would happen is Grandpa would either have to pay for these treatments, if it's a laser treatment or pain medications, whatever, he would have to pay for that out of pocket, or he would have to sue the sponsor. And the sponsor, as you all know, might be a huge multi-billion-dollar corporation. So if your grandpa's anything like mine, he's probably not going to hire a lawyer, which might have a $5,000 retainer anyways, in order to get $2,000 in medical bills covered. He's probably just going to dip into savings and pay for it himself, or whatever his financial situation may be. So what we want to do is we don't really want Grandpa to have to make this decision. We want the subject injury language to be very clear, separated from indemnification, so that we can just submit all of his bills for the kidney stone treatment to the sponsor, and we don't have to ask him at all to consider how he's going to pay for these bills. Hopefully, it's pretty clear why that's the better alternative. So we'll talk now about our favorite subject injury language. So I won't read the whole thing, but I just want to break it down a little bit. First, we're saying that the sponsor should assume responsibility for and reimburse institution for the subject injury costs. And you'll notice that I also included that they'll also pay other service providers if applicable. And this is something that you might have to fight for, or it might be a little bit harder to get into the language. But what we're saying is that, if a study subject is traveling or they need emergency treatment somewhere else, that those those costs would still be paid regardless of whether the treatment is at, the actual institution where the study is happening. And then next up is, the actual preferred definition of what the sponsor will cover, which incorporates the definition of subject injury. Note that we're specifically asking not only for the treatment of subject injuries to be covered, but also costs relating to the diagnosis and or hospitalization of those injuries. And the reason for that is the sponsor might argue the cost to diagnose an injury isn't actually part of the actual treatment. Or let's say a hospital room cost. That's not actual treatment. It's a little easier to argue that one. But to be on the safe side, we like to include all of that in our specification of what the sponsor will pay for. The next part is, saying that the sponsor will pay for the subject injuries resulting from, in the investigator's opinion. And that is inserted because you guys know the investigator is the one who actually has the medical judgment, who's actually treating the patients, who knows the patients. So while it is okay to remain silent on this, it's best to get acknowledgement from the sponsor that the investigator is the one that will, they'll defer to the investigator for their opinion. You might have a little harder time getting them to actually admit that something was caused by their study. And then the last blurb here is what I discussed earlier, that the sponsor's not really going to want to pay for injuries arising out of, our failures, being the institution. Let's say a drug was administered improperly, we forgot an entire step in the protocol, that kind of thing. They're not going to want to pay for that, and that's reasonable. It would ultimately fall then on the institution to pay for those costs. And that's, part of our malpractice policy, most likely. So we covered the ideal definition of what a subject injury is, where you're going to find this language, both in the ICF and the CTA, the fact that sponsors really are the only ones that should be responsible for such costs, even though, they might put some contingencies on what they'll pay for, and why it's not sufficient for a sponsor to say they're only going to indemnify us for subject injury costs. And then I've provided some sample language that you guys can adopt and use in your own negotiations. And just as sort of a summary here, during negotiations, you're probably going to cross a pretty broad range of what sponsors consider reasonable for subject injury. Just know that it is absolutely 100% reasonable to ask sponsors to pay for everything regarding subject injury costs. For example, we get a lot of sponsors saying they're only going to pay after, the study subject's private insurance pays. And, it really, in our opinion, the subjects are the ones volunteering their bodies. And ultimately, the data arising out of these studies is providing a commercial benefit to these sponsors. So there really shouldn't be anything coming out of anyone's pockets other than the sponsor. And that creates quite a bit of arguments during negotiations, but the ultimate rationale is that it's your study and the study subjects are volunteering. So that is it for subject injury. Let us know if you have any further questions, and we'll be happy to help you out in any way we can. Thanks.